Hello everyone, welcome to our latest and probably last for this academic year webinar. My name is Mark Levy, I'm head of the English Programs team at the British Council in Spain, and I hope you're all safe and well wherever you are. So yes, thank you for joining our latest webinar. This is aimed as always for those of you working in the bilingual education project that we run with the Ministerio de Educación y Formación Profesional, for those of you who are maybe teaching in other bilingual or CLIL programs, or perhaps you're teaching English or through English in another context and another program. You're all welcome, and I hope it's going to be of interest to you. Some of you may remember that a couple of months ago, we looked at how teachers can help students process and understand texts based on the knowledge gained from assessing writing. And at the time, we asked teachers whether they'd like something similar for other language skills, and the result is today's webinar: how can we help our learners speak more confidently and effectively? Again, looking at insights from the assessment of speaking proficiency. One of the big advantages of starting English at early years infantil and working with literacy, as we do in our bilingual program, is that children gain confidence in speaking English from an early age. But at secondary, and especially for learners who've had less access to English and less practice speaking English, confidence in getting your message across effectively, especially perhaps in the lessons that are your other subject lessons that you're doing through English, that can be much harder. So what can we do as teachers to help, whether you're teaching English as the subject or teaching your subject through English? To give us some answers, it's my pleasure to introduce again Dr. Victoria Clark, who is Global Assessment Solutions Manager for the British Council. Vicky was a teacher and a teacher trainer before moving into the field of language assessment, and her team works on projects with ministries around the world, providing solutions for their educational assessment needs. As always, Vicky's going to take us through the presentation, and at the end we'll have time for questions. So if you do have questions at any stage of the presentation, please write them in the Q&A box that you'll see on your screen, and those questions will be filtered to me, and then I can ask them to Vicky at the end. So be useful, I mean, just so that I can read them, to be honest, it'd be useful if your questions are short and to the point. And focused on the topic, that'd be great. So that's all for me for the time being. I'm going to leave you in the hands of Dr. Victoria Clark. Take it over, Vicky.
Thank you, Mark, and good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this webinar. As Mark informed you, I work in language testing, and you're probably wondering why insights from language assessment would be useful for teachers. Well, first of all, in order to assess speaking, one thing we need to do is understand how people speak. And what we also need to do when we test speaking is to understand exactly the skills and competencies that students have at different levels of their development, so that we can choose and design relevant and correct tasks so that we can elicit those skills and competencies at that level. So being a language tester gives us a very good insight into the actual skills, and in this case of speaking. So really, I'm going to start with the conclusions, and then I'm going to come back to the conclusions at the end as well, so you can see where I'm going to be heading. But basically, as you'll see from the conclusions, some of these are very, very clear to you as obviously teachers, but there are two main points here I'm going to make throughout this webinar. One of them is the absolute need to reduce the complexity of the task of speaking for our students. And we can do that in multiple ways. And we need to do that because of the complexity that is the skill of speaking, which again, I'll be presenting to you. The second point is that in order for our students to speak confidently and effectively, they need multiple practice in what we call long turns. In other words, not just replying or responding to quick questions, but having to hold the floor, as we say, for at least a minute or 2 minutes, if not longer. And the reason for this, I will also be explaining in this webinar. So focus on these 2 points as I go through, and we're going to come back to them at the end. Throughout this webinar, I'm going to, as I usually do, if you've attended any of my previous webinars, I want to really focus a lot on the theory and understanding what speaking is, because without understanding the skill of speaking, perhaps you don't quite understand why your strategies are working or not working in the classroom. So it really is to give you the understanding of the complexity of the skill and how that can inform what we do in the classroom to help our students. I'll come back to the conclusions at the end. So what are we going to learn? First of all, some important facts about speaking, and then how is it we actually speak? I'll be presenting to you a model of first language speaking and showing how that relates to the second or third language speaker. Then I'll talk about what is it involved in speaking? What are those underlying skills, competencies and strategies that we need in order to speak? And then what is it our students can do at different levels of their proficiency? So a beginner, say A1 or A2 on the CFR level, what is different to what they can do than a B1 or an intermediate student in terms of speaking? Okay, so something you need to be aware of as we go up the CFR, what exactly our limitations are in speaking at those levels. And then in the end, how does all this information help me to support my students in the class? So that's what we'll be focusing on in today's webinars. So let's make a start. Let's talk about speaking. Well, first of all, I think it's important to realize there are different types of speaking. Here you'll see planned speech at one end, unplanned speech at another. Planned speech being, for example, a little bit similar to what I'm doing now, although this is a bit semi-planned. I know roughly what I'm going to say, but a planned speech could be, for example, a keynote speech at a conference, or a sermon in a church, or a speech at a wedding. In other words, something that you've probably actually written down and rehearsed. Unplanned speech at the other end of the continuum is sort of normal interaction in a shop, or with friends, or with strangers at a bus stop. In between, there's a lot. Why is this important to know? Well, in fact, the language is completely different at planned speech to unplanned speech. From planned speech, it's almost written like how we speak, full sentences, formal words, etc. At the unplanned end of the continuum, it's often vague language, not full sentences, a lot of ellipsis or words missing. So we have to understand that speaking, the grammar and the vocab changes drastically depending on the situation. Another important aspect of speaking is that it's in real time. Unlike something like reading, where I can read as fast and slow as I want, or go back and read again, when I speak, I'm on my feet doing it in real time. And as you'll see, that is a real problem for many second, third language speakers, especially at the beginning stages, right up until relatively advanced levels of language proficiency. And we'll be talking a lot about this concept and the cognitive load of that in a minute. Then there's the concept of interaction. When we speak, often we speak with another person or other people, and that's important because in an interaction, we co-construct our message. In other words, what the person says influences what I say. I can't talk about what I want and ignore what the other person is talking about, unless, of course, you're with your husband, then we do that all the time. But in a normal interaction, basically what that person says will actually influence us, and not just the topic, but often the grammar and the vocabulary as well. So that's something to keep in mind. But forget all that. For classroom, why is speaking important? Well, in a classroom, we have to basically make sure they're learning and understanding. And often it's through questions and answers that we get that first quick understanding of their, or if they understand the content. So that's really important. But from another side, there is no language development without speaking. Now, this is a hypothesis we call the output hypothesis, or production, I think is the latest term, hypothesis, where in order to develop our linguistic or language skills in a second language, we have to produce it. I think we all understand that, we all know, for example, that there's an S in plurals and we need to sound that S, but sometimes when we speak, it's not there, right? We also know that sometimes when we speak, we realize we don't actually know how to formulate that message or that grammatical construction. And that's the point. When we produce language, we notice the gap between what we want to do and what we are doing or can do. And that's where people believe through the output hypothesis by Swain, 1985, it was started. That's where we think this gap, this noticing, is the important to the language development. Okay, so speaking clearly, there are many aspects of speaking and it's important. So how do we actually speak? Well, there are many theories here. I'm going to share one with you, which is what we call a modular theory. There are spreading activation theories and other theories, but this is the one we sort of use to help us develop language tests. And there are 3 parts or stages to speaking, how we do it. What they say, and this is, first of all, this model was developed for first language speakers. So we'll talk about the model, then we'll see how it affects second language or third language. Okay, first thing they say is when we want to say something, we first conceptualize it. So look at the picture. For example, my husband wants to go for a walk and I look out of the window and it's raining. Okay, so before I say that, I first have a pre-verbal message. In other words, the concept is in my head. Okay, so the raining, it's raining. And I want to say it's raining now. The next part is once I have this pre-verbal message, then I go to my lexicon in my head and I grab the vocab. Now, it's not just the word, it has to be the correct word for the context, yeah? It has to be the appropriate word for the context, the best way to give that message. So obviously here it's going to be rain, okay? And then I have to grammatically encode it. What does that mean? That means, well, it's happening now, so I'm going to have the ing, the present continuous. So I've got to grab that for my grammatical store in my head. And there's an auxiliary verb is, there's the it, the impersonal subject, there's the time marker now, it's raining now, or it's raining at the moment. And then I've also got to put the sounds to that pre-verbal message, the word stress, the intonation, and all the pitch, the loudness, etc. All that phonological encoding happens there as well. And then the third stage is the articulation stage, where it comes out. So it's the speech, the output. And this is often about the motor skills, the muscles, the throat, the tongue, the lips, the mouth, that's that part. Okay, so let's have a look at this in terms of first and second language. Well, as a first language, the second part and the first part and the third part are probably automatic and pretty easy, right? Now, obviously, sometimes I may not know how to conceptualize a message. For example, let's say the Queen of England was coming to visit you in your school. Now, even for native speakers, we're probably thinking, how am I going to address her? How do I be extra polite? How do I present myself? So even there, the conceptualization could be difficult for us proficient or native speakers. Now let's go to the non-native. Well, first of all, we know that stage 2 is going to be a problem, right? We know that they have limited vocab, limited grammar, limited pronunciation or phonological skills, or incorrect skills in those areas. So that's a problem. At stage 1, it's going to be a problem as well, because sometimes they may not know how to be polite, or, you know, there's a strange man at the bus stop. How do you be rude without offending? So it's the conceptualization itself could be an issue in social pragmatic contexts. The formulation is clearly an issue at the lower proficiency levels. And then the articulation, although we have muscle and the motor skills are there, we may not have our tongue in the right place, or we may not have our mouth in the right place. So as you can see, this is a really complex skill, but it gets worse, because as we're going through conceptualization, formulation, and articulation, we're listening, and we're doing exactly the opposite. We're decoding what you're saying at the same time as trying to think of response, formulate and articulate. And as we're articulating, we're listening and formulating, conceptualizing, formulating the next sentence. This is that real-time processing. As you can see, the cognitive load on our students in the second and third language, when they're put on a spot and say, right, what do you think? All of this is going on in their heads. So this is where I'm going to keep going back to this. We have to reduce the complexity of what the tasks involve for our students, because this, as you can see, how many errors can come out of here? Yeah, if we don't know how the message should be, if we don't know the vocab, if we don't know the sounds, if I didn't hear what you said, as I said, very complex skill speaking. So what is involved in speaking? What do we have to be conscious of? What skills are there? And again, when we speak, it's always a combination of these skills. Again, it's a very complex cognitive, social, and sort of motor skills that you have to have. So all language consists of words, okay, obviously. And it's not just words, it's words have meanings. If I said someone is very slim, that's a nice compliment. But then I would probably turn around and then whisper, actually, she's quite skinny, which is not so much of a compliment. So words and the connotation of words matter. And what I mean by semantics is, let me give an example. Believe, okay, the word or the verb to believe. My cat believes he is king, okay? My husband believes so-and-so will win the football match. When we use the word believe, we need a living subject. A table cannot believe, okay? An inanimate object cannot believe. So believe, the meaning, the semantics of the word believe is linked to animate objects or living things. So that's what I mean by semantics. So when we're formulating, when we're conceptualizing, all of this is taking place. And again, with native speakers, it's often automatic. With non-native, it depends on your proficiency, and we'll talk about that later. The next one I think I've got here is the morphology. Okay, words in English are built by adding bits. Let me give you an example. Here's here I'm going to use it as a verb. Here's a verb, it could be an adjective. Okay, undercooked. So the chef undercooked my fish. Okay, so cook here is the root. And then we have a prefix, the under, it could be over, okay, just to give an example. And at the end here, we have the suffix. In this case, it's a grammatical marker. It indicates a regular past tense. Okay, so in other words, let's go back. When we're formulating, we're grabbing the word, we're looking at the semantics, the connotations, the appropriate word, formal, informal. We're looking at how we have to build parts of that word. And then we have to think about the sounds, the intonation, the stress, the pitch, the loudness, etc. All of that is happening at the same time, okay? And then we have the grammar or the syntax. By grammar, I mean ED is the regular past simple, okay? So by syntax, what I mean is, especially in the English language, we have word order, and word order gives us meaning. So here, for example, take the sentence, the wife stabbed her husband in the back, okay? Now, the wife comes before the stabbing, so now we know the husband is dead, all right? That's quite clear. I can change that. The husband stabbed the wife in the back, okay? By changing the word order, I've actually changed the meaning. Who's dead? Who's the murderer? And in England, syntax in the sense of word order, where things come in the sentence, add meaning, and have grammatical semantic properties. So I'm trying to show you the complexity of speaking here. And then just to add extra complexity, we have to think about politeness. How do we, levels of politeness? How do we, for example, talk to children? How do we talk to our boss? How do we talk to our friend in a bar? How do we ask our friend to borrow their new Mercedes? You know, even with the best of friends, you'll have to change your language. Asking her to borrow £5 or €5 is different in language to asking her to borrow her brand new Mercedes so you can go to the airport. So all of this in terms of the social rules and how we complain, how we turn down politely an invitation, how we make an excuse, all these pragmatic speech acts, functions in language, they need to be understood as well. So all of this is going on as we're listening, as we're speaking, and as we're trying to actually think of our next sentence and understand what's being said, etc. That real-time processing, that complexity. So looking at all that we know about how we speak, the 3 stages of conceptualizing, formulating, articulating, thinking about all those areas that make up the oral speech or oral language, what is it that we actually need to test? As a language tester, we've looked at all this and we see that there are underlying skills and competences involved in all this that we have then broken down. And basically in our language test, in our speaking test, we attempt to target these competencies and skills, elicit them so that we can measure them. So these skills are, okay, the sounds, that's fine, that's quite clear. Grammar, I think accuracy, that's also quite clear. Fluency, careful with what we mean by fluency. Fluency has many definitions. The definitions I'm going to use here, just for simplicity, is around in terms of tempo, in other words, it's speed, the number of hesitations. In English, or in England and in most English-speaking countries, we have little room for long pauses. We do not tolerate long pauses in speech. If someone pauses, often somebody will jump in and fill the gap out of nervousness, or in other languages, I believe Finnish, my best friend is Finnish, so I know these things, has the longest tolerance for pauses. So they can, in a party with a lot of Finns, there's a lot of pausing. But in English, in England, that's never going to happen. So fluency is this idea of keep going, making sure that the message is continuously given without too much stopping and thinking as you give that message. Now with vocab, we've got to test whether it's the correct vocab, the correct word for the meaning, but also appropriate to the context. Discourse management, and a lot of these overlap, everyone, so you know they're not so neat. Discourse management is when we have, as I mentioned before, a long turn. In other words, I have about at least talking without interruption for a minute or so. Usually in chatting with your friends, you say something, he says something, you say something, he says something. Okay, quick. But if I said to you, look, I've got some great gossip about Mark, then everyone is going to shut up and leave me the floor. And then I will have a long turn. In other words, over several sentences is what I mean by long turn. And that's where we have discourse management. If I'm going to be talking like now, actually for a long time, then I need you as the listener to follow my train of thought. And to do that, I need some skills, discourse management skills, discourse competence. In other words, I might say something simplistic like, well, first he did this and then he did that. Okay, that's nice and simplistic. I might have other ways in which I can help you to follow my train of thought, repeating, you know, not only did he, but, you know, let's not forget, you know, and there's many ways I can try to keep your attention. Now, obviously now in a very long turn, I have now, you have slides, I keep repeating myself, I'm using similar words. that's how my discourse management works. Going back to my conclusion, I showed you at the first, the absolute importance of long turns in the classroom helps our students to improve their discourse management and improve their fluency, as well as all the other skills. Without long turns, they don't get the practice in this, and it makes speaking extremely difficult. Because also in long turns, we have to then use strategic competence. What does that mean? When we come to something where we don't have the vocab for, or we don't have the grammar for, or we don't know how quite to say it politely, then we have to rely on some strategies. Now, a very obvious strategy our students might use is shutting up, right? Rather than saying something that is wrong. Other students may avoid difficult grammatical constructions or use other grammar. We might choose different words, or not quite the correct word, but a near enough word. We might paraphrase. We may perhaps coin a new phrase, make up a word. Without having to do a long turn, we do not get that practice in strategic competence. And strategic competence basically forces us to use our entire linguistic repertoire in our head, plus all the other non-linguistic cognitive talents that we might have around skillfully maneuvering, changing the subject, etc., in order to keep going. Now, even as a native speaker, if you made me stand up with no preparation and talk for an hour, my biggest strategy would be to go a bit slower. I'll go and speak a little bit slower because I'm going to have to think at the same time as speak. It'll be the slow end of normal, but it'll be the slow end. I also might, try to repeat myself a lot, etc. To give myself time to think. Now, another thing we need to assess in speaking tests is your ability to manipulate or use language flexibly. How do we talk to people we know and love, our husbands, our family? How do we talk to colleagues? I mean, for example, you may say darling and sweetheart to your husband. You certainly, hopefully not, would say that to your boss, okay? There are certain ways in which we speak to people in certain circumstances, and that's the ability to use language flexibly for the right context. That's pragmatic social linguistic competence, basically. And then, of course, if we're in a 2 or 3 of us or more, the ability to turn take, jump in at the correct moment, hold the floor if I want a longer, by saying I've got a really good piece of gossip or I've got a great joke, will often allow people to stop their speaking and let me speak. So that's that sort of interactional competence. And again, we know how people speak, we know what skills are involved, and we know that all these competencies and skills are there in order to speak effectively. And we have to make sure our students are able to get practice in this. Otherwise, they won't speak confidently. So I go back to the first slide. We reduce complexity and we ensure longer turns. And I'm going to come back to that a bit later. Okay, all well and good. So what can our students do at the lower levels in speaking? And what's different at the higher levels, and how does that help us to understand? Well, I think you all know the CEFR. This is one of the old, what's it called, diagram or picture that you often see. It's useful because it tells us at the A levels, it's basic. At the B levels, it's independent. I'll explain all these. And at the C levels, it's proficient. But now, in the 2018 companion volume, or the updated CFR, if you wish, we prefer this diagram because, let me just move my something away from my screen, because what we know is when we look at the CFR levels, it's never this pretty, like this different colours all nicely separated. It's more like the real rainbow. Now, I'm an A2 in Spanish, everyone, right? Okay, I'm learning Spanish, but I'm not really an A2. in some aspects, I'm an A2. In some aspects, I'm an A1. I think pronunciation, I'm certainly an A1. But in grammar, obviously because of my field, I think I'm a B1. So you're never, but overall, I'm an A2, right? But even in one skill of speaking, there are some aspects of speaking, such as pronunciation, that will be better than others. So there is no such thing as a complete separate in the CFR. So some of our students will be very jagged profiles in their skills. Like, for example, their reading may be much higher than their speaking, but even in their speaking, they'll have jagged profiles in the various skills and competencies I've just pointed out, and much, much more. It gets quite a lot complicated when we dig into those deeper. Okay, so let's have a look. This is an overall spoken production. Now, I'm going to make these slides available to everyone, but I'm going to push on because I'm going to give you a bit more detail for each level in the next slides. So if you could just quickly read A1 for me, I'll then explain what's important about this. Okay, I said you'll have these slides available to you, but very important words at A1, which is it's not the lowest level. We have A0 is no language, then there's pre-A1, but let's just start at A1. You have very, very basic and very basic, familiar, concrete, everyday. All these words are really important. Personal. What can you do at A1? Well, actually, A1 is only really the word and phrase level of speaking. Yes, there may be sentences, but these sentences are often about chunks or lexical phrases, I think we call them now, that you have and you can just quickly access. So, for example, as I said, I'm an A2 in Spanish, but at A1, I learned me gusta mi gato, for example. Again, as you can see, dreadful pronunciation. But what that means is, even though that's a sentence, it doesn't mean at A1 that I can then use similar constructions. So I know you've got me interessa now, because I'm A2, and other, I can't think, but I know that, and I could use that. I can also construct sentences using the indefinite pronoun, the me, te, le, etc. I can't do that A1. At A1, I'm really still at the word and phrase level with any sentences being chunks. What's also really important is it's really personal. It's about who you are, your age, your family, the colours, your food. You know, it really is a really limited, familiar environment. And the person who's interacting with you has got to be very patient and very kind, because you're going to do all the work. Whoever interacts with this person, it says here, prepared to help. I think that's an understatement. You're going to have to ask the questions. You're going to have to listen carefully because the pronunciation is going to be quite difficult. You're going to have to guess what they're trying to say half the time. So there's a lot of burden on the interactor. So what about A2? If you could read this. Similar words, basic, familiar, simple, immediate, everyday sort of thing, routine, everyday. Okay, we're still at the basic user level, remember A1, A2. And here, the difference between A1, A2 is we're now on the sentence level. Now, not only can I understand sentences, I can start to communicate and construct simple sentences. Again, very familiar topics. Home, family, food, hobbies, pets, etc., colours. But I can start now with A1, I can say I like golf. But now at A2, I can say I like golf. I play golf once a week. Golf is expensive. Sometimes it rains. I don't like golf. Yeah, I can start, okay, obviously with errors, but I can start now to elaborate, add detail to what I'm saying. So a little bit of description. So a little bit more on the sentence level. Okay, and again, whoever's interacting with an A2 student has got to do a lot of work. The A2 student may be able to ask you, where do you live? what do you like? Yeah, what do you eat fish? You know, those interesting questions we have with learners at this stage. But you still have to do a lot of the work in trying to understand their accent and trying to guess their meaning in many cases, because it's very limited. Now, we're going to go on to B1 now. Now, B1 is seen as an independent user. Read this and I'll tell you how to be careful with this level. Careful with the word independent. It's independent in the familiar, and that's very, very different to the next level, which is B2. What do I mean by familiar? Again, home, work, life, family, pets. So I may sound quite fluent at B1. If I were, let's say, a teacher, I could say, yes, I'm an English teacher. Well, not a teacher, perhaps, but perhaps teacher from Asia, where B1 is actually probably their usual level, if we're lucky. You know, I'm a teacher of English. I like to learn English. My students are very clever. They work hard. I love my job. Last year, I went to London. London is a beautiful city. I stayed. No, I'm really starting to talk now. And I can talk about my hopes, my dreams. I can elaborate. I can describe in quite, you know, a lot of description. I can even hypothesize, reflect, predict, you know, oh, I think that would be a good idea because I can give reasons. And it seems quite fluent in the familiar. Now, that's so if we're talking about something we know or very in that personal sphere, then you will have the vocabulary, they will have the grammar. Please note, there are errors at all stages, but B1, there are still many errors. We may have learned some things so they're automatic, you know, things like my name is, I live, I like, etc., some sort of easy sentences or because, you know, some constructions like that. But when we try to go a little bit more complicated, we're certainly going to have quite a few errors. And there's errors in pronunciation, and there's errors in vocab choice, and there's errors in many aspects of the language, social linguistic, discourse, etc. It's really important that these errors, you understand, can cause difficulty. In other words, they can cause breakdown. So if you think to yourself, I don't quite get what she just said. So you ask, look, I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Or do you mean? That's at a B1 level. Because the difference between B1 and B2 is just that. Let me go to the next and you can read that. Well, first of all, the difference is in terms of errors. In B2, we still make errors. Let's make that very, very clear. There are still errors at B2. The difference is these errors do not impede communication. So if someone speaks and talks to me, they may get the wrong word, they may get the wrong grammatical construction, they may use something a little bit strange, too formal or too informal, but the message itself will be very clear. I will not often, well, it'd be rare for me to say, I don't know what you're talking about. Whereas at B1, that's going to happen. That's one point. That's one important distinction between B1, B2. B2 is independent in all concepts, not just the familiar. Now I can talk about other subjects such as architecture, technology, things that are outside of my interest and my skill sets. I can interact with people without being a burden at all. You won't have to have a strain for my pronunciation or grammar, as I said, because the message is going to be very clear. And that's really important, that there's that degree of fluency. And here's the word spontaneity. Yeah. So we've got that automatic processing because we've got a lot of vocabulary and grammar now. But more important, we have fluency and spontaneity because we have strategies. Not because you know all the vocab and grammar. What you do know is ways to get around that. Because you've obviously got these chunks that you've said a lot, you've read a lot, used a lot of language. So you've got these ready-made chunks that you can just grab. like happy birthday or good on you or you must be joking. You know, these sort of chunks that help us to be fluent because they come naturally and quickly, and then what we then have to process and conceptualize, formulate is less because we have these chunks. That's how native speakers speak fast. And also we have we've learned strategies. You know, we know vague language, we know how to get around these issues, and we can talk about a range of subjects, and we can go into detail, and we can understand complex and topics said to us, so we can process them quickly, so we can interact with people at a natural speed. With the C, I'll do that very quickly before I go on. It is only really at the C level where we have control of our grammar and our vocab without too many errors. Errors are quite rare at this stage. Errors exist all the way through. Native speakers have errors, usually slip of the tongues, but native speakers have errors. So errors exist all the way through. Here we have control and use language flexibly. That's where we also can control the social linguistic pragmatic elements of language, because we've been exposed to enough, we've used it enough, we've spoken many different situations and contexts. So there we have this slight difference between that B2 and C1, and it really is around control, flexibility of language, if anyone's interested, and the social linguistic aspects. Okay, I didn't do C2 because there's minor differences between C1 and C2. So what does this mean for my students? Well, first of all, speaking is frightening at any level in another language, and even in your own language. I think the biggest fear for most people is public speaking in their own language, let alone standing up in front of a class and using your dreadful second or third language. So we have to reduce the stress, reduce the complexity. One way I encourage the teachers we work with is to, rather than wait for someone to volunteer to answer a question, because we know who it's going to be, is to say to everyone, right, okay, here's the questions I want to ask you. Have a couple of minutes and have a think. Either, you know, spend a minute writing them down or thinking of some ideas, and then you might choose someone. Or think, share with a colleague, and then share with the class. I think why? It allows people to activate that conceptualizer and activate the formulator without being in real time. And so that helps them. Sometimes students say they don't know the answer because they don't want to say the answer, if that makes sense. We all know that. But by giving them this option and then choosing them, you reduce that anxiety. Also, another issue that I find is the non-recognition of errors being good. Errors are up until your C level. So unless you all have C1, C2 students in your class, and if so, you're very lucky, there's going to be errors. I think teachers do not recognize their own errors and celebrate them enough either. By having an error in class, it's good for students to also realize that teachers make errors. And I think it's a natural process of language development, and to actually point out your errors that you make to students, because if you can make errors, so can they. Students see modeling. And I think, I remember talking to a very famous professor in China, who's a professor of English and works with the Chinese government on developing tests. And he said he didn't want a native speaker to teach him English when he chose at university, when he first went, because he knew that would be never a model he would replicate. He wanted the teacher who spoke quite badly because he thought, I can get there. I thought it was a very interesting concept, actually. He does actually speak fluently now, but that's another matter. So I think we should celebrate errors. The next thing is to give them that opportunity for the long turns. And that's what I mean by different task types. It's not just about giving a one-word answer, or that's not going to activate any skills that they need to be fluent or have discourse management or strategic competence. That's going to get them through any situation, not grammar and vocab. Grammar and vocab errors are forgiven by most native speakers. you know, in some ways, they don't even recognize them often. My husband's an engineer, and sometimes he doesn't even realize people are making errors because he's not focusing on people's errors in English. But what is unforgivable or which causes problem is the real hesitations and the real incorrect ways of saying things or strange ways of saying things. That leads to communication breakdown. So not only give them, and don't make them stand up and speak for 2 minutes. Again, just say, here, have 1 minute to think about what you might say, and then 1 minute to share with the class what you thought, you know, this lesson was about. Or if you were a reporter, give me 4 questions that you might be asking and ask them to your colleague. Give them the chance to have long turns, but give them a little bit of a help. Again, reduce the complexity, give them just enough time to give an idea of what they might say, not rehearse it, an idea, because that then activates that conceptualizer, formulator in advance. Roles. In order for people to know that there's formal, informal, important people, less important people, nice people, not nice people, and how we deal with that. The role in the classroom is often you're the leader, they're the underling. It might be nice to change those roles where, and then they then have to formulate language in different ways. In a history lesson, it's quite easy. One could be the king, one could be the, you know, the servant or whatever. But it's really important that we give them an opportunity, and also we allow them in this comprehensible input, which I know you do, so I won't dwell on that, by pre-teaching, by helping them, by activating their knowledge in advance, so that the input that you give them, the listening, which is the input to speaking, is more understandable, to reduce the complexity of then the speaking. Okay, and then very quickly, the last slide is about this. One thing that I've been looking at we've been looking at universities in an Asian country for the government, and we find that when teachers ask their students to do tasks, they don't give clear enough instructions. The students then spend their time thinking about how to do the task. In addition to all the other thinking you need to speak and to perform the task, you don't need that. So it's really about making sure the instructions are clear, what the purpose is, what you want them to do, what the outcome should be, how long they've got, how you expect them to go about it, etc. And even modeling that. Okay, as a teacher, say, if this was me and it was this topic, not that, I might do it this way. Again, reduce the complexity. And by also talking about how you might go about it, you start to activate the cognitive processes. The open and closed questions. The asking them, checking information is fine. And as teachers, you know you have to ask open questions. It's not, I'm not going to talk about that, you know that. But when you do ask open questions, again, reduce the complexity. Give them a minute, or give them perhaps on the board how you might want them to structure what they're going to say. Reduce the complexity. Then they will be able to activate and practice that speaking. And then finally, when we give feedback to our students, make sure it's targeted and encouraging. If for some reason there is a constant problem in pronunciation, then you might want to take a student aside and say, look, I've noticed, interesting enough, that you always make this sort of mistake, and sometimes it's difficult to understand what you mean. But then give them an exercise, or look together online how they might find exercises. It's no good to be told what my problem is. I need to know how to fix it. You may not be English teachers, but you're also second or third language speakers of English, so you would know yourself how to look that up. I think that's also really important. Going back to our conclusions, reducing complexity, that's clear. Time to think, so they can activate and allow them to have longer turns. If they have time to think, their responses will be longer. When they have longer turns, then they'll be able to activate the strategic competence, their interactional competence, perhaps if it's with other students, their fluency, their discourse management, and they'll be able to put more vocab and grammar together to practice that. And then again here, don't separate on, okay, I mentioned a pronunciation error, but that's only if it's constant and problematic to the message. if there is slight pronunciation issues and they are at a level where that's going to be obvious, there's no point telling a B1 that the way they construct a third conditional is always wrong. Of course it is. They're B1. It's going to be until they're C. So careful, sometimes you can't fix things at their proficiency level. Feedback is necessary, absolutely. Feedback and form is necessary, but make it targeted and only if the message is at risk. So I'm going to leave it there. So Mark, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, if I can do that 1 second. Okay, I'm stopped sharing.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much. I mean, I think, it's really important that I think as teachers, we really do understand that the levels of complexity of speaking, because I think it's very easy for us in the classroom to focus on perhaps things which are less important and miss the difficulty of the whole process of decoding, encoding, articulating while you're decoding and encoding over and over. I mean, as a native speaker, how many times do you have a problem in a relationship, with your wife, with your husband, with your partner, just because you've misunderstood something, and that's two people speaking in their first language.
Or you're not listening, Mark. That's what husbands do. You just don't listen. There's a difference, nothing to do with speaking.
Okay, so that's obviously a failure of the decoding.
Yes.
Exactly.
Exactly.
We've got a couple of questions. I mean, some of these are connected to that. There's a couple of questions. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned about long terms is obviously the question of confidence anxiety and the need for preparation. And I think that also there's something in that about the long term, apart from the preparation, there's something about the long term, which is also about the role of the teacher during that long term. And the whole question of correction or not correction and correction techniques. Do you want to say something about that, perhaps?
Yeah, long term is never about correction. In long term, what we're trying to do is we're trying to encourage fluency. Now, fluency is supported by strategic competence, so all these strategies is supported by the accessing chunks to make it a little bit easier, so that we have more time to think about things that we do actually have to formulate. If a teacher stops and corrects, all of that goes out the window because we can't focus on what the teacher says as well as doing all these. So when there is a long turn, I would never ever stop a student, and I would let them finish. And in fact, so long as there were no pauses that were hugely long and they managed to keep going, and they were under the sea level, of English, then they have accomplished what they can do at that level. If they were a proficient, then there shouldn't be an issue anyway. So I think it's really important. If you do notice something really quite basic that they should, let's say at B2, they should have, let's say the past tense, for example, or present perfect with no time or something like that, or to show experiences, then you might want to take them aside later. But in a long term, the goal is to keep going. So you can activate all these things. Now, yes, they're going to make mistakes, because the more we speak, the more we make mistakes. And another factor is, which I didn't mention, we don't have time, is the personality. Some students are risk takers, some students are not, and that will impact the way they speak. It's very difficult. My field is assessing speaking. And to try and unpack an unconfident speaker being paired with a confident speaker in a test is a real challenge, which is why I'm actually against paired candidate assessment, even though I know it's popular. So there's all these elements involved.
And that's quite interesting, maybe for another conversation, in fact. The other thing, I mean, connected to that, I think, is the question of what are barriers to communication. So not necessarily, as you say, in the long term. So I mean, one of the things that I think a lot of teachers worry about, because they're worried about their own, is pronunciation. It's obviously, it's an area where, if you're not comfortable with your own pronunciation, then you worry about it, and you also maybe worry about your students' pronunciation as well. There's a term, isn't there, that people use about, which is comfortable intelligibility. The idea of enough to get by. Anything that you might want to add to that?
Yeah. Well, testing has evolved over the last 40 years, and in the old days, going back to the 60s, we used to talk about native speaker pronunciation. Now, that's just absolute rubbish. We know that now, and we talk about intelligibility. Unless you are highly talented, and then you should be a spy. As an adult, if you're going to learn, or anyone over the age of 8 or 9 learn a language, is going to have their accent. Simple as that. Even children who are brought up, I'm being brought up bilingual. I have a dreadful accent when I speak French because I got educated in Germany, just to make things confusing. For me, I think people don't accept the fact that pronunciation that doesn't sound like an East London person like me, but sounds like a Spanish person, is perfectly fine. I don't understand why people wish to sound different. And I think we pass it on to our students. Having a Spanish accent speaking English does not mean you are not fluent. I'm a German translator by first profession, and I have an English accent, and yet I'm a professional translator interpreter. I don't understand why I'm not German, and German is in fact my third language, so I'm not going to sound like a German, but I will be correct in my message and my vocab and my grammar at my level, obviously. I think we just have to get over this fact and stop comparing ourselves because we're never going to achieve native speaker sounds. It's just not, unless, okay, if you're as a child you might, but certainly not as a young person or an adult.
Yes, and if you heard me speaking in Spanish, you'd have to agree with that as well. Somebody just asked or said, rather than a question, somebody just said, accents are beautiful and part of a multicultural world, and that's exactly right. And I think the idea that we try and knock them out of us is ridiculous.
But I mean, we have English accent, American accent, Irish accent. If you even take the native speaker world, we have Indian English, we have Filipino, you know, some of these Singlish. Exactly. What English accent would you like?
Yeah. And I think maybe the point to finish on, you know, just to sort of restate, and maybe you want to add something to this, is the point you made that there is no language development without speaking. So, you know, whatever our reticences as teachers in the classroom, we have to allow our learners to speak, to have these long terms, because otherwise they're not really going to ever develop their language, which is why we get the profiles, or we used to get the profiles that we had, for example, in Spain, where, you know, the learners had great grammar, you know, reading, writing okay, but couldn't say anything because they've never been given the opportunity to speak. And
we still have that. We still have that. And it's not just not being able to speak in class. It's even if you are very proficient. I mean, I'm sure there are English teachers in this audience who sometimes when they speak, they make ridiculous mistakes, like really simple mistakes, even though they're C1, C2. Where that comes from, it's often your mind's, you know, wondering about something else, or it just happens. Errors are always going to exist. So we have to look at what level our students are in English and their level in speaking, not their level in reading and grammar, because we have jagged profiles, and accept that those errors are acceptable for that level. Sometimes teachers correct. I've seen teachers correct children when they, you know, with errors that a B2 person would make. So I think we just have to understand more about the levels of our students and what is possible and what we should achieve. Because if we go and try to ask them to do things they can't do, they'll lose motivation.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, and a good place for us to finish, I think, because that in a sense was where we started. What are we learning about supporting our teachers and supporting our learners in speaking from the world of assessment? And that is, you know, that's partly that, isn't it? Is that, you know, there's no point correcting things that they really don't know at that level in the first place. So why waste everybody's time?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks so much for that, Vicky. Thanks again.
Very welcome.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. That was the last of our webinars for this academic year, I think, unless we come up with something else between now and the end of May, June, which is unlikely. So probably the thing for me to say is have a great summer, everyone, and we'll be back, I think, with more webinars from September. So I hope everybody stays safe and well. Hopefully by the time we're back, we may not be all in our homes doing this. And have a great summer and take care. Bye, everyone.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.